Hi, this is John William Toohey. We're back again. We've got a great story here today. We have a new book that's out. It's called Doc Boss. Eddie McGrath, who's quite a character. Eddie McGrath and the West Side Waterfront. Eddie McGrath and the West Side Waterfront. It's Doc Boss. And the writer's here with us today, Neil G. Clark. He was a researcher, writer. He's working on another book, I understand, still in the same genre. He put 5 years of his life into this, which I can believe. I did about the same thing. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
I'm
excited to be here.
Good. What I thought we should do is explain to folks, because many people don't know. What McGrath was in the 40s, correct?
Yeah, he really was one of the characters that really went the whole way, but his real prime was definitely the 30s to the 40s.
Why don't we explain to these viewers, many people who watch this, they don't know. What was the condition of, now we're in the New York City waterfront, the west side of New York, correct? What was going on then that gave rise to someone like McGrath?
The waterfront in New York was really its own world. There was these neighborhoods that bordered, and we picture New York City nowadays, high rent, nice shops, but back then, we had rough waterfront neighborhoods. As you can imagine, it piers lined all around Manhattan into Brooklyn, and there was just hundreds of piers, and it was really one of the main employers in New York City. The waterfront neighborhoods were always rougher neighborhoods because the housing conditions around there, they, were dealing with shipping, smokestacks, you name it, definitely like port conditions. So it would be like living next to the ports you see nowadays, so a lot of the rougher neighborhoods were there, a lot of immigrant neighborhoods. There's Irish waterfront neighborhoods, Italian waterfront neighborhoods. And what we saw was really a growth where you saw organized crime grow up out of these neighborhoods just because they were poverty stricken. But the industry of the waterfront was so important to New York City. Manhattan was an island. Like nowadays we have planes, trains, and taxi cabs, but back then waterfront shipping was really the method of shipping. And to feed the largest city in New York City, we had produce coming in every day off boats. You had all the goods coming in every day. So the waterfront really was one of the most important industries. If it was shut down, the city was shut down.
Yeah.
So when we saw organized crime, it started as grassroots. Toughest guy in the neighborhood controls the docks. Toughest guy controls the gambling and the loan sharking. And then as organized crime grew in the 1930s, and really we saw that organized element, they became a controlling factor in the labor movement. And from there, we had these powerful waterfront characters.
Yeah. And eventually when replaced Prohibition, when Prohibition went, it was their backup.
That's what it was, yeah.
What neighborhood is that? Does it have a name?
What Eddie McGrath was, actually, it's interesting. He was from the east side of New York City, and he ended up kind of juvenile crime. His mother died, his father died, and from there he started getting involved in this low-level crime. He ended up in Sing Sing for just a really basic robbery. And when he was in Sing Sing, he started meeting these guys from the west side. They all hang around on the handball court together. And when he got out, they hooked up with the goal of taking over just a single dock where they would control like the loan sharking and the gambling on the dock, steal some valuable cargo. And then, as you said, Prohibition ended, the labor movement started. We had different laws enacted, like the New Deal law, which, increased the power of the labor movement at the time. And it allowed them to infiltrate the unions and actually become these important, legitimate labor officials, when really they were gangsters and they were murderers. So the neighborhood he was in was primarily Greenwich Village and Chelsea. Hell's Kitchen had its own gang running that. And then the East River had its own gang that was Italian. So every single waterfront neighborhood had their own. But the west side was, Greenwich Village had some of the busiest docks in New York City and some of the most valuable ones on the North River. And that's where he was based.
I drove by years in the 70s, but I never realized that Greenwich Village, they were there. They went there.
Yeah.
Really?
By the 1970s, they were almost all gone. They really had a peak where it was 1920s and then started declining in the 50s, where, it just, shipping started moving to New Jersey.
Yeah. Well, I think, Rudolph Giuliani said it best, the mafia cost New York City its pearls. They're in Atlanta now, these ports, San Francisco. They just got fed up with the shipping lines just had enough and left, you know.
And containerization really killed them too. You know, we used to have longshoremen were needed. There would be, you know, hundreds of men shaping up to go into the belly of a boat and pull out all the cargo by hand and use loaders. And, you know, now when things started coming in on giant containers,
Yeah.
you needed large places to store them. So New Jersey just had like meadowlands, you know, where New York City was all built. They could never handle containerization.
Good point. What was the, let's go over the hierarchy so people understand how powerful these guys were. So we've moved ahead into the 40s. Albert Anastasia has declared himself God Almighty Emperor of the Waterfront, right?
Yeah, it was a real cooperative. So Eddie McGrath, when before he ended up on the waterfront, Prohibition is just like you said, when Prohibition ended, all the gangsters scrambled for these new rackets. Eddie McGrath was he was a bootlegger, and he actually worked for Joey Rayo up in Harlem, selling like illegal booze. So when Prohibition ended, he still had all these connections to the Italians. And one of his best friends was Jimmy Blue Eyes Allo. So I'd say Eddie McGrath really was a close associate of the Genovese family. So when you had the Gambinos in Brooklyn, and then in Manhattan on the East River, you had Mike Clemente, who was a Genovese family, and then the North River was considered Irish. And at that point, we don't think of Irish organized crime as a powerhouse anymore, but at that time, those neighborhoods really were exclusively Irish neighborhoods. Italians didn't have control over them just because, you know, there was no Italian people in those neighborhoods. It wouldn't even work as a cooperative. So the West Side waterfront really still was an Irish controlled thing, and they got along well with the Italians. Like, it wasn't an issue or a fight. They would never thought of going into Brooklyn, and the Brooklyn Italians would have never thought of coming into the West Side just because they were so entrenched in those neighborhoods.
So there's 3 points. One is that when Kazan decided to film his movie on the waterfront, which has its roots here, apparently Hoboken was almost exclusively Italian labor, but his argument was this is about the West Side in its prime, so it's not about Hoboken. Also, I wanted to point, I guess you know, Allo was in The Godfather, was portrayed as Jimmy Allo backwards.
Oh yeah, that's right. There's a Jimmy Ola or something like that, right?
So Allo. And then lastly, Rayo, who you mentioned, of course, is the food, Rayo's.
Oh yeah.
Rayo's restaurant, do you know the?
Yeah, oh yeah, I know Rayo's, yeah.
Same.
Is there a relation there?
Yeah, there is. And also the guy who played the chief FBI guy on The Sopranos, the one sort of a pointy face.
That's right, he was the owner, right?
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Anastasia is the ruler over the West Side waterfront, correct?
He definitely had the Brooklyn waterfront was him. It was always the Gambino family, and at that point it was Anastasia. So he controlled Brooklyn, and different family controlled the East River. And then the West Side was it was its own, like, as I said, they got along well with the Italians. They worked with the Italians, but the West Side waterfront, every union was Irish, every official was Irish, like all the longshoremen were Irish. So, I mean, you know, it's just like anything, they dealt with their own at that point. And as I said, by the 1950s, those neighborhoods were changing. And I think that's reflective even what we see in the organized crime makeup on the West Side at that point, where the West Side shrunk to organized crime just became Hell's Kitchen. Greenwich had changed, Chelsea had changed, but for the West Side Irish during the 1930s to the 1950s, they were like autonomous from the Italians, and they were definitely like a power in their own right.
I have a note here that he worked under Oni Madden. Is that true?
Oni Madden, he didn't have any connection to Oni Madden, but he did deal with a lot of associates of Oni Madden, where these guys, by the time Prohibition ended, Madden had moved to Hot Springs, and kind of as Madden was leaving, McGrath was arriving on the scene. So there was some crossover there, and a lot of Oni Madden's associates were some way connected to the waterfront too. There was R.D. Beeler, who was the one who was convicted of manslaughter with Oni Madden back in the early 1900s. He was a really close friend of McGrath's. And most of the Oni Manning gang after Prohibition, they kind of got into gambling rather than the waterfront, because they were older at that point too. They were all in their 50s, even going on their 60s. But a lot of McGrath's gambling, funneled into them, and
Yeah.
it funneled into each
Yeah.
other. But they were still there too.
I do want to talk about the crimes that went on the waterfront, but I've got McGrath is having 12 arrests that range from petty larceny to murder, apparently. And
That's right. Yeah. He started out, his first arrest was late in life. McGrath was a really interesting character where early on he finished grade 8 back then and even started high school, which was kind of a rarity. He had jobs as a clerk, telephone company. He could read, he could write. And then after his parents died, he started hanging out in rooming houses, getting into prohibition, fell into the easy money. And when he was working for Rayo used to use him as a salesman in neighborhoods that weren't Irish. McGrath could talk. He was a real talker, and he was a booze salesman. So then from there, it became petty arrests and things like that. His first arrest, he broke into an ice cream store at night, threw a brick through the window, and stole pennies from the cash register. And then it progressed to armed robberies, where he was actually a notorious armed robber during Prohibition. So he was selling booze and he was robbing, he was doing everything. And eventually he got brought back in front of the judge on one of the armed robbery charges he was facing. And the judge said, "We don't have enough evidence here to convict you, but what have you been doing over the last few years since I last saw you in my courtroom?" And it turned out to be the same judge where he broke into the candy store all those years ago. And since then he had I think it was 6 or 7 arrests, armed robbery, discharged, armed robbery, not guilty. And the guy revoked his parole, and he went to Sing Sing for 5 years for breaking into that ice cream store.
wow, he was first generation?
Yeah, his parents were both Irish. His dad died when he was very young. His mother remarried. He only has he has a lot of half brothers and sisters. And then his mother died later on, nearing his teenage years. And from there, he kind of distanced himself from the home.
So we have this thief, gunman, murderer, probably, who is an ILA officer. He's an officer. The ILA, but well, you go ahead. Tell us what the ILA.
Yeah, they're the International Longshoremen's Association. Essentially, at that point, they were the most powerful longshoremen's association in America, and they had exclusive rights for all the bargaining contracts and all the ILA locals, New York all the way down to Texas, and they still do. ILA today is one of the most powerful unions in the United States. Yeah. And McGrath at that time, when he started out, the ILA, he was just kind of a dock thug. He controlled what they called loading, which at the time was a quasi-legal business where when the trucks would come on the docks, the longshoremen would put all the goods on the docks, but it wasn't part of their contract to load them on the trucks. So they had these loaders who would come and just for a day's pay would be the middleman between the trucks and the ship. And essentially the gangsters used to control it. They used to come and just take a cut of the loading for that day. And McGrath was a loading boss back then. And what had happened was Joseph Ryan, who is one of the most famous labor leaders in America, he was the boss of the ILA, this big figure. He was kind of the barroom politician, big red-faced Irishman, and he controlled the Longshoremen's Association with an iron fist. And what it was happening was he was losing control of the Longshoremen's Association on the West Coast because there was a movement where they felt the East Coast ILA was corrupt. And he really was corrupt. He was the power base of the ILA. And he was losing position, and he feared all this kind of West Coast sentiment would sweep the East Coast. So instead of, battling it with his, just his wit and his charm, he battled it with his fist, because that's how labor unions were back then. So he started making pacts with gangsters all across New York City, from McGrath to Anastasia, and he would sign them up and he legitimized them and he put them in power positions to keep the rank and file members in line.
And the West Coast, I think, was spurred on by the communists. I think it was a big socialist.
Harry Bridges was his big kind of adversary on the West Coast.
Didn't get traction here. And well, it probably didn't get traction because of McGrath and his pistol.
They had some, but it squashed. They had a lot of murders connected to it and things, and
Looked into Joe Ryan. There was nothing. He wasn't well educated or whatever, but he was wealthy beyond. He had a chapel in his estate, a church, a small church.
Yeah, and then ultimately, in the 1950s, when the waterfront corruption came crashing down, that's what he was convicted of, embezzlement from union funds. But
Oh, that
back then, the books weren't ever kept as tidy as they are today.
I didn't know that. I didn't know I thought he walked away clean. So
He
really,
didn't end up serving any time in prison. He was convicted and sentenced to prison. Then, due to health issues, they postponed his sentence. And then he died of natural causes not long
yeah.
after.
Now working with, so they've got gambling, they're stealing cargo, they're robbing the unions, they being the mob. Anastasius on top, it's being pumped up to him through field generals like Eddie McGrath or people under McGrath. So McGrath would be a capo, we'd say a captain, do you think? Is that about right? Or
I'd say he'd be autonomous. Like he probably had limited dealings with Anastasia. If anything, he was feeding up money to Aloe, but in the sense, a lot of the times, I don't think he was feeding up money as much as he was facilitating, like helping out, like favors that were the big thing. McGrath was, even up to the 1970s, when people needed a favor on the waterfront, he was connected to the people that came after Joseph Ryan. He had their phone number, he had their ear, and waterfront, a lot of favors, whether it is businesses opening up or union friendly contracts or getting your cousin into the job. Like he was valuable in that sense, where I don't know if he was kicking up in the traditional sense of like, an envelope every month, but he was definitely, he was friends with a lot of people.
influence.
Yeah.
I want to go back for a moment. You were talking about these day laborers who would come in. Was that the beginning of the, what was it called, the roundup? Where they threw the work chits and was that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was how the mob controlled it too. It was the West Coast. They did it based on seniority hiring. So you would come in and they had their board there and, the ships. How Joseph Ryan really kept control and used the mob to assist him keep control is the shape up. So, essentially all the neighborhood men they would come in when they knew a ship was arriving. The hiring boss would stand in the middle and choose the number of gangs they needed based on how big the ship was and things. And essentially, if you didn't play ball, you didn't get picked and you weren't on the waterfront because the mob controlled the hiring bosses.
Yeah.
When they started looking in the 1950s, how many of the hiring bosses were either related or criminal records or different relationships with men like McGrath or, as I said, Anastasia and Brooklyn, like, they controlled the hiring. And when you control the labor, people would play ball and the hiring bosses would take advantage too. People would kick back a percentage of their day's wage just to work. Like it was a very important position on the docks.
But so we've got him. He's a frontline guy still. He's actually on the dock. So where is Anastasia's brother? Joe, was it
Tough Tony Anastasio. He went by Anastasio, like rather than Anastasia, which was just Anastasia's way to distance himself from the family. But Tough Tony Anastasio had his own ILA local in Brooklyn, and then when later on he became so powerful, he merged actually almost all the Brooklyn locals and was the in charge of that. But he had no significant criminal record, so he was really Albert's front man on the waterfront.
Yeah, that's what I assumed. He was the face of the organization on the waterfront, but
yeah, he'd be at the ILA meetings, meeting with the press, those type of things. He's
are you in New York? Are you a New Yorker? Or?
No, I'm in Toronto actually.
I was going to say, is this President Street? I know where that is in Brooklyn.
That's right. Yeah.
The same area.
Yeah, it was all that area in Brooklyn where they had control over almost all the locals in Brooklyn. It had started with the Camerata locals, which was a family that was close to Anastasia before that, and then they kind of inherited it from there. But it was six ILA locals all in that area that were really big and all tied together, and Anastasia controlled them all. Like when you look at it, they were all relatives or friends.
Yeah. I wasn't sure where he fit, Tough Tony. So he was a frontline guy as well, and he kept Alfred insulated from, right?
That's right, yeah.
Moving to Cockeyed Dunn, Johnny Cockeyed Dunn, and Sheridan. They were both under McGrath, right? They both worked for.
I would say, yeah, Squint Sheridan was definitely under. He was their enforcer. And then Cockeye Dunn, if anything, he was, I'd say, McGrath's partner. The two of them were connected at the hip. And Cockeye Dunn was actually Eddie McGrath's brother-in-law. He married one of Eddie McGrath's half-sisters.
I didn't know that they were partners, though. I didn't know that at all.
Yeah, Cockeye Dunn actually, he was another one. Eddie McGrath held the title of ILA organizer, which was kind of a he wasn't connected to one local. He just worked for Joe Ryan directly, and his role was just to make sure enough men appeared at the docks every day, which there was a surplus. So I mean, it was a nothing role. And then Cockeye Dunn, Eddie McGrath, and Cockeye Dunn actually had their own local within the ILA, and Cockeye Dunn was the business agent of it, and yeah, so he had an official position too. But the two of them, Eddie McGrath's arrest for murder, there was together on one of them. He had two arrests for murder. One of them was with Cockeye Dunn.
He started early, at age 15. He was already had convictions. He was arrested at 16, robbing hardware stores.
That's right.
Farm school.
He was much more the traditional waterfront character. McGrath doesn't fit the mold with early in life. Cockeye Dunn was real right from the beginning, and that's who Eddie McGrath met in Sing Sing. They were both serving a sentence at the same time, and Cockeye Dunn was a West Sider, so Eddie McGrath joined him on the West Side, and there was actually a giant war in 1935 that resulted in dozens of deaths, and they were on the winning side, and their actual boss at the time was one of the people murdered, so they just inherited the rest of the gang, and the rest is history.
Do you remember who that was, who the boss was?
Oh, their boss was Joe Butler, whose father was actually one of the highest ranking ILA officials in the early 1900s. So Joe Butler was ILA royalty at the time, and he was the leader of their gang, and he was murdered in 1936, and by the other side in the war. And then the other side lost out due to attrition. They were led by Charlie Yanowski, who was another waterfront character.
Yeah.
And so when he went to prison, his gang fell apart, and Eddie McGrath and Cockeye Dunn were really one of the only ones left standing at the end. So that's why they had a nice fearsome reputation where no one wanted to mess with them, and they had the rackets after.
So in 31, Dunn goes to prison for 4 years for robbing a poker game, of all things.
Yeah.
I didn't know they could send you to prison for that. 1935 war, was this something, unfortunately on these sorts of programs, we have to range between going into the simple explanation to the really complicated, because a lot of our followers know this up and down. So, and I should know, 1935, was that a mob war or just a local war on the docks?
You know what, when I wrote the book, it was just a bunch of unconnected murders, but when I actually got into the police files and got into the reports, they were actually all connected, and it was two different groups that were actually one group in the beginning. They had a big falling out, and half went with the Joe Butler group and half went with the Charlie Yanowski group, and throughout 34 to 36, as I said, there are a dozen murders.
Yeah, so this was a labor war, not an organized crime.
Organized crime. They were fighting for the docks, but at that point, no one was ILA officials. No one was connected. It was over more street level rackets.
Yeah. And then he went to work for Joe Ryan, right? He and McGrath went to work for Joe Ryan. Who was Joe Ryan? I mean, we discussed a little bit of him, but he was a very affluential guy. He had a lot of pull with the Catholic Church in New York, I know, which was in the 1940s. They were a powerful organization. The church was a powerful organization. And he needed that, my understanding, to almost give his blessings that this was a benevolent fellow and a good Irish Catholic and so forth. And he used it for all he can get. Who was he? Where did he come from?
Yeah, he was a really charismatic labor leader that's kind of in the mold of those old school labor leaders, where he was rough around the edges. He came up on the docks like in the early 1900s when New York was even organized in the ILA. He was a part of that, and he was part of one of the original locals in New York City, and he was a West Sider too. So he always had a soft spot for the West Siders, which is why he was close to Eddie McGrath. But more than that, as you said, incredibly charismatic, incredibly powerful. He was there at all the mayor's dinners, like you name it. He was hobnobbing with the, New York society at that time.
And he answered to the actual Mr. I don't have his name. I have it on another page. Mr. Big, who was, what was his name?
Bill McCormick. He owned McCormick, the McCormick line, which was on Pier 32, and the two of them cut from the same cloth. You know, they came up at the same time, and that was one of those where you kind of wonder, a labor leader, really good friends with like an employer. It's not usually what you see, but the two of them, you know, I'm sure they helped each other out along the way.
Yeah,
sure.
But he was the power, right? In the end.
Yeah, they called him the Mr. Big, and it's debatable, but he was definitely had one of the biggest say on the waterfront. Even when you see the movie at the end where they call and there's just a hand on the phone, you know, that's supposed to be him in the movie where they, you know, he's controlling the strings. But he was like Joe Ryan, where he just had connections, he had money, he had say, and he played ball with the gangsters because that's how he came up in the world too.
Yeah, and Dunn, who I just found this out. Oh, by the way, something else I recently found out is working under Dunn, I have the union here, I have the local here, was Barney Baker.
Yeah, Barney Baker was one of their enforcers, like right way back to the 1930s. He was actually that Joseph Butler that I mentioned, who was the leader of their group. Barney Baker was present when Joe Butler was murdered.
Really?
He was shot. He was shot. He lived, but he was shot.
Wow. I didn't know that. He was basically a thug, a torpedo, who answered directly to Hoffa.
Yep. He was kind of run off the waterfront in the 1940s. Cockeye Dunn was executed for like a waterfront murder. Barney Baker was wanted in questioning for it. McGrath sent him down first to Vegas, where he stayed at the Flamingo where it was being built. And then he never ended up returning to New York City because he was worried about being questioned with that murder. Ended up working for Hoffa because the labor circles all were tied together. So they got him a job, essentially working for Hoffa, and he became one of his favorite, as you said, bodyguards. And you see him in a lot of the pictures.
Bobby Kennedy called him the ambassador of mayhem.
Yeah.
He was just there to beat people up and intimidate people. He was just a goon.
Yeah.
I think, by the way, it was where he, in Las Vegas, that he ran into Jack Ruby. And so the conspiracy people have really taken that and run down the field with it. Although I think they were just two working class guys out in a little place of Las Vegas. Las Vegas is a lot smaller, and they ran into each other. I don't see any. George Donahue was at a meeting. He was a Catholic trade unionist.
Yeah, that's right.
Gave rise also to Father Corridon, who's based on the movie on the Waterfront. Oh, let me go back. I'm sorry. Eddie Kelly held out against Dunn, and that's who he killed.
Anthony Heinz was the one he was convicted of murdering, and Anthony Heinz was the it was after the war. The dock started opening back up. He was placed in charge of Pier 51. Dunn and McGrath said they wanted it back. You know, it was their pier, and he wasn't willing to play ball. And that's where you see the comparisons to On the Waterfront, where they started pressuring him. They shot him in the leg at one point. He just wouldn't take no for an answer. Dunn committed the murder himself, even though by this point he was higher up, but it's because he had lost a lot of face on the waterfront. So it was him and Squint Sheridan and a third man, and Hintz on his deathbed gave a deathbed confession naming Dunn as the killer, and that's how it ended up in the electric chair.
So it wasn't. I see. Eddie Kelly was a thug under Dunn who called a strike on his own.
Eddie Kelly was on Pier 51. Dunn always had a bee in his bonnet about Pier 51. Before the war, Dunn was trying to control Pier 51, and Kelly was a hiring boss on the pier who wasn't playing ball. And essentially, Dunn invited him out and punched him in the face. It was just like a bar fight. But at that point, he shut down the pier. Dunn was the one that told no one to show up for work the next day if Kelly was there and to work. And the problem was a British freighter with war supplies was due and it wasn't worked on. So they actually charged Dunn and a couple members of his gang with coercion, which was like a unused charge at the time. Essentially, he was blocking the war effort. So he actually went to prison over that. And then after the war ended, it was at Pier 51 again, and it was Anthony Heinz who was refusing to play ball. So Pier 51 was, Dunn didn't like it.
it says here he got a letter of support from Adam Clayton Powell, who was,
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
and the U.S. Representative George Tickham stood up for him to get him off of these charges.
Yeah. And they got lots of letters. The Army started writing letters about how Dunn was helping out with the war effort and things. It was really, they were bombarded, the parole board.
I wonder if perhaps that, I don't know the dates to make it work, but the Navy intelligence was using the guy who ran the Bakers Union on the docks too. So I wonder if it's, to get intelligence about the invasion of Sicily and so forth. So
Yeah.
there's some relationship there that, for the military to step in, and because that's really unusual for them to do.
And they do say Dunn was providing, they called it labor peace, but there's always been the reports about they were using the mobsters to look for spies on the docks too, anything unusual. And he was definitely involved in cooperating with like the Army at that point.
Interesting. Barney Baker, George Donahue, he was a Catholic trade unionist, and he saw some of Dunn's guys at a meeting, is my understanding. Are you familiar with this? And said,
Yeah.
why are they here? So, and asked the guy to throw them out, and he said, if we throw them out, they'll kill me tomorrow morning. And then what happened? Donahue just took it and ran with it?
Yeah, he was, his story, he published it, but I'd say his story was like really the same as like a lot of the men on the docks, where he had a union and he was an educated man, and then he saw these thugs just showing up and single-handedly taking over the union, and no one would speak up about it, and he was vocal about it, and essentially got roughed around at the meeting. And the next day, one of the men was Barney Baker, who actually showed up and was arrested for assault because he did actually press charges, but Baker miraculously got off, which just furthered Donahue's belief again that he was against the bigger corruption.
I put together a small film today of Bobby Kennedy questioning Bobby Baker, Barney Baker. And you can tell by the film, and he really was just a brute. He intimidated even on film.
Yeah, he's former boxer, big guy, former heavyweight.
And Bill O'Dwyer was the mayor. He was miraculously absent from all of this.
Yeah.
And he was police commissioner prior to that, wasn't he? Shouldn't he have stepped in?
You'd think, but the cops loved, like, they always said Eddie McGrath put more cops to work on the docks than they could even count. They'd all retire. Back then, police pensions nowadays are one thing, but back then they would all take security guards, watchman jobs on the dock. And Eddie McGrath had a lot of friends on the police force. Even when Cockeye Dunn was facing the murder trial, there was a cop that told his wife not to testify because these were, friends. The captain of the homicide unit sat down with the DA, who was William Keating at the time. They were in a restaurant together. He took him out. And the restaurant, Keating didn't know, but the restaurant that the captain of the homicide, Dan Mahoney, took him to was actually owned by a member of the Dunn McGrath gang. They sat down together. Guess who came over to eat dinner with them? Eddie McGrath came over to eat dinner with the DA, who was, the assistant DA, who was going to be charged with prosecuting his brother-in-law. They had a meal. He said Eddie McGrath was feeling him out the whole time to see if he could be corrupted, but didn't push him on anything. And at the end, excused himself, said if he ever needed anything to call. So, I mean, Captain Mahoney of the homicide division is facilitating a dinner date between the assistant DA prosecuting Eddie McGrath's brother-in-law and Eddie McGrath.
Yeah. In Chicago, these things are in the past, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, a little bit in the 60s. They were just blatant with this corruption between the police and prosecutors. In New York, it's always been sort of sedate. It's there. Everyone knows it's there, but they don't push their they don't come out and push their influence and say, I know, blah, blah, blah. So
yeah.
Johnny O'Keefe, where does he fit into the world?
John Keefe, is that the one?
Keefe. Yeah, I'm sorry, John. Yeah. He's a bank.
Yeah, him and Mickey Bowers were part of, the Hell's Kitchen group. So they were separate from McGrath, but McGrath had actually helped place them in that role. There was a mini kind of Hell's Kitchen dock war in the 1940s, and McGrath wanted to stabilize it. So he was friends with Mickey Bowers and John Keefe and put them in that spot.
So what we have are fiefdoms. We have the Irish West Side, but not all the West Side. The Irish didn't control, they controlled portions where the Irish were in big numbers. And then there was the Italian, I know Hoboken, I'm sure there were other Italian docks, but they were all under the same umbrella of Anastasia, correct?
I would say that Anastasia only controlled Brooklyn and kept control of Brooklyn. And I would say that the Genovese family had control of New Jersey by the 1950s. The West Side docks were always Irish, but they started dying off in the 1950s. So it was a cooperative. It was a real, like, they would sit down at the table and handle disputes. McGrath would meet with Anastasia. There's documents about them meeting and things if there was labor disputes. But the ILA has always been Irish. Even now, when you look at like the leadership, it's always still tied to the West Side because that's where it started. Like, so that's why McGrath was kind of always used as an arbitrator for it. Even the Italian groups who he got along well with.
One of the more fascinating was Local 824, John Applegate, who's just a character. I mean, he's a book in himself. You come across him?
I did. He was friends with John O'Keefe, who you mentioned, and Mickey Bowers. They had been robbing banks together in the 1920s, but he was small guy, I think 5'2", but like feared, very feared on the waterfront. And he was well liked on the waterfront by everyone too. He was, as you said, a character. He was out and about, and he was a hiring boss actually on, I think Pier 88, maybe something in Hell's Kitchen.
He survived a while too. I think he went into the 70s. Did he not?
Yeah, he was around for years after, because Mickey Bowers, he died in a car accident in the 60s, but his son John Bowers actually was president of the ILA like after Teddy Gleason. So there's always they found out John Applegate was working as a clerk after they cleaned up the waterfront and banned everyone with criminal records. They did an audit on Local 824, like you said, the pistol local, and they found out that John Keefe and John Applegate into the 60s were clerks. They were on the books, but no one ever saw them at there.
We don't want to give away too much of the book. People need to buy this. Do you have a copy of the book in front of you?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so, well, you go back a little bit. And so there's the cover. We have to cut off about an hour, so in just a little bit. But there's the book. We're going to put this on, and at the end, there'll be a photo of the book. And right now, the smartest thing to do is just go to Amazon and get it, I would think. It's the quickest way. And it is Barricade Books there. I don't want to ask you what became of McGrath because it'll sort of give away no? Yeah. I think the Gambinos or Genovese, I think they still run New Jersey, the waterfront there.
Yeah. Without saying anything to get myself into liable territory or anything, the Waterfront Commission still believes that there's mob influence on, especially as you said, in New Jersey. The Brooklyn docks nowadays are just like the West Side ones. They're not very big anymore. New Jersey's really the port, like Elizabeth there. Yeah.
Dorothy Day, who was an American Catholic worker. Do you know Dorothy Day?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
An impressive woman. She did a lot of work on the Italian waterfront, not on the Irish side, but in the Italian, because they needed more help. There were language problems and so forth. And she's written extensively about it. And that's another way to look at the life on the waterfront, which was really tough. And it spawned, I think it may have spawned Capone to some degree. He's from the waterfront. I can't, life of me, remember the name of the neighborhood that he's from. It's where President Street is. But anyway, Joey Gallo and all those guys. This is your first book. You're getting great reviews. You're number 300 on Amazon Crime Books. That's fantastic. Because there's a lot of them. So 350 is very good. Good for you. Congratulations. what, you're a Canadian, you're a young man. What brought you to the waterfront?
It was, I actually read TJ English's book, The Westies, years ago. I probably was 12 years old. It was a long time ago. And I remember reading the book and thinking, like, what happened in between? Like, this story and like Prohibition and Oni Madden, who I knew about. And I had found Eddie McGrath, but I couldn't find anything on him. So as a kid, I sent away a letter to the FBI, did a Freedom of Information request. I didn't know what was happening. I just sent it off and forgot about it. A year later, year and a half, might have even been 2 years, like a giant box just shows up on my doorstep. I'm still only maybe 15 years old at this point. My mom sees it and she's, why is there a box from the FBI on our doorstep? Like, what are you doing? Are you in any sort of trouble? I open it. It's just photocopies of McGrath's entire file. And I didn't write the book at that point, obviously, but I researched it, and I'm sure with research, you pull one thread and it leads to another and it leads to another. And then at some point I thought, I have so much here. I put so much time into this. I need to put this out there. So that's why I decided to write the book.
Good for you. You've got all that material. You're going to use it for another waterfront book, perhaps?
I think I'm done with the waterfront for now, but something New York based again.
Yeah, good. When do you start? Now? Are you starting? Have you started already? Or you just?
Yeah, I'm pretty far into like the next topic, but it's, as I said, a little different from organized crime, but definitely touches on it. And it's been fun to research something new after so many years on the waterfront, but I still pulls me back. I still put in a new research request or try to find something else. It always is there.
Have you been down to New York?
Oh yeah, many times, even for a bit of the research.
Yeah. Because you can squint and sort of get a feel of what it looked like. A lot of the houses are still there. It's becoming trendy now. Well, Brooklyn. Yeah, becoming very trendy.
You pay for a waterfront view. Back then, you couldn't give it away.
I know. But Capone was from there. I don't know if you know that. He was from that.
Yeah, Brooklyn. I don't know where in Brooklyn, but as you said, he was definitely Brooklyn based.
Still there, oddly enough. So,
yeah.
The book is Doc Boss, Eddie McGrath, who the fellow was, Eddie McGrath, and the West Side Waterfront. So it's Doc Boss. You can see it when we put out this film. Eddie McGrath, the West Side Waterfront, and the author is Neil Clark. There's Neil right there. And I was sort of hoping your kids could come in and make noise.
I gave them away for the day. No.
I've got my dogs here, so children are always welcomed here.
Yeah.
Busy child is a sign of a happy child. Thank you for coming here today. I truly appreciate this, and we'll get this up in a day or so. Thank you.
Sounds good. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you. It was great.
Come back.
Definitely.
Bye-bye.